You guys, let's go through chapter 10. Our land, public and private use of our land, is interesting because we've just finished studying populations a little while ago and looking at what happens when species reach carrying capacity. And what's interesting about human beings is we're one of probably the only species that can kind of contemplate what happens when we approach carrying capacity and what we need to do to expand carrying capacity with a growing population. We know that it's not feasible just to get rid of people. So over a long period of time, while we are trying to ease our footprint and ease like energy consumption, resource consumption, it's interesting to see like what we do to maintain our population sizes. So let's look through the first half of chapter 10. We're going to look at human land use and how it affects the environment and how we categorize land use. So the opening story talks about the comparison between the Pacific lumber logging land with Maxim, a group of MAXXAM. It is a comparison that looks at the difference between, I'm going to go ahead and put the Pacific Lumber Company here, Pacific Lumber Company versus Maxim. So, all right. So the comparison of these two right here is the difference between selective cutting of trees and clear cutting. And you can kind of see the difference here. This is all clear cut here. This is all clear cut here. And this led to some pretty dramatic effects. You can see that this is on a mountain, and we talked about dirt and soil, and the nature of the soil for a specific ecosystem not only has to do with the composition, like is it sand, is it silt, clay, not only the type of plant life, not only the weather, not only the climate, so that we can speed up processes of erosion, but also the topography. So if I'm on a slope here, there's definitely a bigger risk of erosion if I don't have these nice root systems, right? If I don't have these nice root systems. So if you look at this video here, erosion in soil, if you look at this video,
but we don't want the water to shape our.
Meet the sky real quick, but you can kind of see like this is what we're trying to do with our plants right now. Some of them are doing pretty awful from break, but I think you guys did a pretty good job. You can kind of see that it's pouring water in here. You can see all the soil. You can see all the soil that's going through because there are no root systems here, right? You can see here the one with mulch is about to pour. The water kind of slides off the top here. And you have a little bit clearer water, but you can see, watch this guy right here. This is our ryegrass, is what we're kind of working on. I want to see if we can get ours to look kind of like this. You can see the water's coming out basically clear. Right? So that was the whole point of that lab. It's a physical property of soil, right? So that's kind of the difference here, and this led to some really awful landslides, which destroyed a lot of homes. And this was kind of talking about the conflict between private versus public land ownage, and also the idea of tragedy of the commons, right? So if we have publicly owned lands, like who should get the rights to be able to use them? How do we make sure that they're upkeeping and taking care of them? Should there be no regulations whatsoever? And if we have private land, should you be able to do whatever you want? Do I have total freedom to do whatever I want on my own private land? Well, I mean, you could argue yes, but you could also argue that if I'm throwing a really loud party in the middle of the night that is so boisterous that I keep my neighbors up, even though I'm on my own property, there might be some legal ramifications I could face because I am disturbing the peace. Now, this here, I would say, definitely qualifies as disturbing the peace because you get all this soil to come down. Maybe this is my private land, but right underneath it, I have somebody else's private land, right? We got a bunch of houses here that's not owned at all by Maxim, right? But since their land and their practices on it affects me, you can argue that this is kind of a spillover, right? So this is something you might have to address. All right, so that's kind of the opening story there, and those are the conflicts. Okay. Every human use of land alters it in some way. People do not always agree on land use and management priorities, is what we're just talking about. Tragedy of the commons, externalities, you need to make sure you know that. These are unintended consequences. They could be good or bad, right? But most of the time we talk about them in a negative aspect. And we're going to look at maximum sustainable yield. All right, let's move right along. Tragedy of the commons was talked about. Shared limited resources become depleted because everybody acts out of self-interest and short-term gain. When people share a common resource without any sort of regulation, it is likely to be overused quickly. And usually we have a classic story of cattle on grazing land, right? So they overeat everything. Okay, so here it is right here. Right, so over time, you notice this nice lush green grass is now completely brown. The externalities, cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase. So this is not factored in, right? Environmental scientists are concerned about negative externalities. Why would we be concerned about positive externalities, right? We're not really concerned, but it is nice when we see an unintended good consequence, right? Because that informs us as to how to shape policies in the future for land use. All right, maximum sustainable yield, or MSY. The maximum amount of renewable resources that can be harvested without compromising, this is very important, without compromising the future availability of that resource. We usually say that it's around half of whatever carrying capacity is for a specific ecosystem. Okay? And it's very hard to come up with this number, right? If we're talking about trees, right? If we're talking about, all right, well, we know that we need to have at least 4 trees or something like that, right? In order to maintain our carrying capacity at that point. It's really hard to tell because human populations change over a very long period of time, right? And you know that if everybody stopped having children today, it might take 20 to 30 years to see a decrease in the population growth. So establishing what half of carrying capacity is very difficult. This is a very, very difficult task to be able to carry out, right? So it can take months or years to determine whether a yield is truly sustainable. All right, we say that it's about half of our population size is when we're going to have the fastest growth, right? We try to keep our maximum sustainable yield around here. Right? It's very, very important. Remember that. It's trivia there. All right. So how are public lands distributed? You can see that in Europe. National public lands all over the place. That makes sense because Europe has a lot of small states. International, both. All right, that's kind of cool. Right? Just kind of give you an idea of what percentage, just looking at it, is public land, right? All right. So how do we categorize public lands? We have national parks, which are exactly what they sound like. What I would do is I'd make like a little table, maybe like a little category list. So you have like science, maybe recreational, beauty, landform. So you have like monuments, right? Or like national, or like physical, natural monuments. So what I would do is I'd put like natural parks. I'd put MRPA, or managed resource protected areas. And what I would do is I would go just through and check off like which ones they have, just to kind of help categorize. So you can eliminate things that are specific to only one of these, right? So managed resource protected areas, what does that mean? Sustained use of biological, mineral, and recreational sources. So they can be used for recreational purposes as well. Habitat species management areas, they maintain biological communities. So you notice that this doesn't have recreational, doesn't have landforms or anything. This is just for the purposes of taking care of specific animals and endangered species. All right, so let's see some more. Strict nature reserves and wilderness areas. They protect species and ecosystems. So this isn't just animals, but it's also the trees and things that are there, special types of flora. Right? Protected landscapes and seascapes permit non-destructive use of natural resources while allowing for tourism and recreation. So this is kind of the sea equivalent of kind of how national parks work, right? All right, let's see. National monuments are designated to protect unique sites of special natural and cultural interest. So this is, like the Grand Canyon or something, right? So you notice the western United States has the majority of our protected public lands. And we're going to go into a breakdown here, but you need to know this. 42% of the land in the United States is publicly owned, so that's almost half, right? 25% is owned by the federal government. 2 important numbers probably keep in mind. Half, right? Resource conservation ethic, the belief that people should maximize the use of resources based on the greatest good for everyone. So this is really tough because when we get into conversations and we allow certain individuals to get in that have only corporate interests in mind, right? It's very hard. It's very, what I say is good for myself might be very different than somebody who has a different, motive in life, right? If your motive is profit driven, it's very tough for us to even come to the table and have the same discussion, right? If the greatest good means financial gain, That's a very different battle plan for taking care of the environment or using the environment, right? And then you get into these conflicts of short-term versus long-term good. Right? Multiple use lands. This is very important as we get into like our later chapters. We start talking about urban sites. U.S. classification uses designate lands that may be used for recreation, grazing, timber harvesting, and mineral extraction. And that you saw some of that in some of the bureaus earlier. So look at this. Majority of our land, grassland grazing. Then right after that, we have timber. And then cropland right after that. So we use a lot of our land for agriculture as well. More than 95% of all federal lands are managed by 4 federal agencies. So you should know these: the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, used for grazing, mining, timber harvesting, and recreation. U.S. Forest Service, USFS, timber harvesting, grazing, and recreation. So again, I would probably make like a little table, like a little checklist or something, right? Fish and Wildlife Services, conservation, hunting, and recreation. You've probably, if you're a hunter or you go out in nature, you've probably dealt with some of these agencies in some way, maybe for permits or something. All right, so this is the second half of Chapter 10. We're going to explain specific land management practices for rangelands and forests, describe contemporary problems in residential land use. So this is going to be when we start talking about urban sites, right, and how cities develop. All right. Management issues differ for rangelands, forests, and parks. So rangelands, talk about rangelands. They're dry, open grassland. And obviously, the risks that we have here are fire. Right? Fire. Grazing too many animals can quickly denude a region of vegetation. Loss of vegetation can lead to land exposed to wind and water erosion. So wind is going to blow the dirt away, so water is going to carry it away. Obvious, right? And one of the really big things here is if you don't allow fires, right? So like we say fires are a risk, but if you don't allow fires to naturally happen, if we overprotect rangelands by not allowing things to graze there or whatever, like those, you end up with a lot of built-up brush. So the next time a fire does come through, it can be very, very dangerous. Right? So that's something that I've seen in FRQ before. All right. Forests. Forest land dominated by trees and other woody vegetation, sometimes used for commercial logging. Okay, so this is, as you saw in that pie chart before, there is a really big percentage of our forests that are federally owned land that is used for timber. 73% of forests used for commercial timber operations in the U.S. are privately owned. So this is the vignette I was talking about at the beginning of the lecture. This conflict right here, the fact that it's privately owned, what right do we have to say what they can do with their land or not do with their land, right? But then you start talking about, well, the stuff right outside of their land isn't theirs, and it affects them, right? So that's something to kind of think about. Timber harvest practices including clear cutting and selective cutting, and we talked about that at the beginning, okay? And that's what these mean. Also remember that there is another thing that usually goes with selective cutting, or even clear cutting sometimes, of cut and replant. And there might be a better term for that, but I think you can get away with just saying cut and replant, or tree replacing. It might come up right here. Okay, there we go. Clear cutting removes all the trees from the area, usually coupled with replanting. Okay, there it is. The resulting trees are often the same age. Selective cutting single trees or small numbers of trees are harvested. The resulting forest consists of trees of varying ages. You do want trees of varying ages in the forest. It's good. If you take out like a small, so let's say I have like just a small area, and a bunch of trees all over the place, right? But then I just take out this one section here, maybe this one section here. What we end up with is when we replant, these trees will all, of course, be smaller than the trees around it. And that's good to have trees of varying ages, right? For different types of species, we did an FRQ about beetles, and they like only certain types of trees. You don't want to have trees of all the same age, all reaching maturity at the same time, and then leading to like an infestation of beetles that only like mature trees or something like that, right? Okay. The third approach to logging, ecologically sustainable forests. Obviously want to know this one, right? Has a goal of maintaining both plants and animals and as close to a natural state as possible. Ecologically sustainable forestry is an approach to removing trees from forests in ways that do not unduly affect the viability of other trees. So let's look at what that means. Right? So reforestation. Timber production presents ecological challenges. All logging disrupts habitats, obviously. Right? This is a human activity that can affect biodiversity. Right? Logging often replaced complex forest ecosystems with tree plantations. A tree plantation is a large, typically planted with a single rapidly growing tree species. So this is something that we would consider monoculture. Right? What's the problem with that? Is that not all birds like living in the same type of trees. Not all animals like eating trees of the same age. If something comes along and is like the kryptonite of this type of pine tree that you're planting, you risk losing the entire forest. And if you lose those trees, what do you end up with? Erosion. Not good. Okay, fire management. Fire is a natural process for recycling nutrients. So remember our nutrient cycles. Humans have followed a number of fire management policies. Prescribed burn. Fire deliberately set under controlled conditions to reduce the accumulation of dead biomass. Dead biomass, not mass, does increase the risk of fire. So if we protect the forest too much, stop natural processes from happening. Even if our precious houses are in the forest, then we risk great fires that are really hard to put out. Okay, fire management. So Yellowstone fires of 1988. Extensive areas of the park were burned in this exceptionally hot and dry year. Right? And this is because it's so hot that if we don't have these prescribed burns, they can get out of control. Our national parks are managed for scientific, educational, aesthetic, and recreational use. Remember that aesthetic just means nice looking. It is pretty. Human overuse can harm the environment features that attract visitors, right? So this is one thing that you can say, like, oh, if we protect it, more people are going to want to go out there. National Wildlife Refuge, federal public land managed for the primary purpose of protecting wildlife. National Wilderness Area is an area set aside with the intent of preserving large tract of intact ecosystem or landscape. So you can kind of get like what these agencies do, just feel like what's in their name, right? Like, what do they protect? Here's some acts that you may want to know. These are things that you want to quote when you're doing FRQs. Enforce the laws on the books, that sort of thing. So pause this and kind of take a look at that if you need to. All right, so now let's talk about where most of us live. Okay, suburbs, an area surrounding a metropolitan center, comparatively low population density. Exurb, an area similar to a suburb, but is unconnected to any central city or densely populated area. So if the city, a different color. So this is the city with high population density right here. Suburb will be surrounding it, but still connected. Just get there pretty easily. But the exurb will be maybe disconnected completely. This will be your exurb out here, right? It's like living out in the sticks out in Helotes going towards Castroville or something, right? Since 1950, more than 90% of population growth in metropolitan areas has occurred in suburbs. Very important. Let's put those two numbers together. 2 out of 3 people now live in suburban or exurban communities, so that's 66% of people live out there. All right, cool. All right, look at residential land use. Urban's gone up, rural stayed pretty consistent. This is because there are jobs here in the city, right? So we talked about this in class the other day. We differentiated between urban sprawl and urban blight. But sprawl means to spread out, right? And you're spreading away from the city. Urban sprawl has 4 main sources, and we talked about this: automobiles and highway construction. And just know that this is because gas taxes increase money for these guys, right? And automobiles increase gas, right? Because we have to use gas to power our automobiles, and the taxes go back to highway construction. So this is like a positive feedback loop, right? Okay, living costs as they go up in the city, it's really hard to own a condo downtown in San Antonio, so you're going to go out to the suburbs. You're going to move away. And good thing we have our automobiles to help us drive and commute, right? Urban blight. So as people start moving away, they start taking their tax money with them. You start having less services. You increase crime. You don't have things like police officers. You don't have nice things anymore. The city gets polluted. And then what ends up happening is people want to move away, and they want to move away. This is called, in your textbook, I'm going to put quotations around it, this is white flight. And you can kind of imagine where the term probably comes from. All right, government policies, right? So if we allow like things like factories to be in very close proximity to where residential areas are, then it's going to increase things like urban blight, pollution, and crime. All right. Urban blight is the degradation built in social environments of the city that often accompanies and accelerates migration to suburbs. All right. So here's a nice little feedback loop here. Cool. Okay, so urban sprawl. Here are some policies that have led to urban sprawl. Okay, so highway trust fund. Induce demand. What's that mean? Increasing the supply of a good causes the demand to grow. So if you have a higher supply of nice houses out in the suburbs, then oh man, that looks good. I want to move out. I want to move out of the city. Okay, zoning is a tool to separate industry and business from residential neighborhoods. So if you work at a factory that's in the city, or you work at a factory that's far away from your house, guess what you're going to have to do? You're going to have to drive. You can also do this the other way. You can make sure that you keep things that are not desirable in your residential areas out so that people want to stay there. Any multi-use zoning, this is a good thing right here. It allows retail and high-density residential development to coexist in the same area. And the good thing about this is that it increases walking, or in general, just low use of fossil fuels. Okay, so you can walk more places, you don't have pollution, it's more desirable to live there, you don't have to drive as much, so tax revenue for highways goes down, and you end up keeping people in the city. Right, so here's a feedback loop for urban sprawl. You probably want to study that. All right, smart growth. So let's look at smart growth. So like, notice here, I have a lot of people walking around. Things like parks in urban areas are really, really good. Make people want to stay, gives people a reason to like their community, right? You have community and cultural buy-in. You do things like revitalization projects. You do infill, right? Infill. You develop areas that are already established, right? Instead of developing the suburbs, you develop the city. You put things like libraries. You do like what we did in San Antonio with the Pearl Brewery, right? And other areas like that, right? So this used to just be like a crappy industrial park, right? Factories, paint factories. But now look, you can walk along the Riverwalk. You have these beautiful apartments, condominiums, restaurants to eat at. Walking, there are a lot of bike paths downtown. So it's kind of a nice area to be. I didn't want to be there when I was a kid. Okay. One of the hallmarks of smart growth is mixed land uses, and we talked about that already. You know, this land can be used for parks, it can be used for business, it can be used for shopping, it can be used for jobs, right? But the important thing is you end up having walkable neighborhoods. You don't have to drive 30 miles to do stuff. Okay? You also create a range of housing opportunities. You don't just want really, really expensive houses or Section 8 houses. You know, you want to have a mix of the two, so people of all different walks of life can stay there and have the same opportunities, right? I go to the same school as somebody who makes, you know, $250,000 a year, and I only make, you know, $30,000 with my two parents, right? It ends up kind of democratizing education and opportunity. You encourage community stakeholder collaboration and development decisions. So you have kind of community planning, right? What do we want our neighborhood to look like 5 years from now? Stakeholders, a person or organization with an interest in a particular place or issue. You know, these two things right here give rise to things like parks. And the good thing about parks is that you end up having a diversification of your land use. So you don't have just all pavements, right? You decrease paved surfaces. And why is that good in relation to dirt? Remember we talked about dirt a few chapters ago. Well, if you have a decrease in paved surfaces and you increase things like dirt, trees, what's this going to lead to? A decrease in erosion. And we're going to retain water a lot better, right? You can also get more locally produced food and goods by having things like in the movie Dirt, like rooftop gardening and things like that. So we also take advantage of compact building design. We're not sprawled out all over the place. This is cultural right here, strong sense of place, natural beauty, all this good stuff, right? Always remember the aesthetic things. Okay. Transportation choice, transit-oriented development. So we're looking at public transportation versus having your own car. You do have to. You do have to use transportation to get somewhere. So here's infill. So vacant lots and things like that become nice little parks or maybe even community gardens. Right? I've seen these down in like Alamo Heights. There are a couple of community gardens out there. Like the Greenway, right? The Greenway that goes all over the city. Urban growth boundary. So you have regulated restrictions for designated areas. All right, and that's chapter 10. Good luck, guys.